Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 703, and today is November 1st, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Hope you all had a good Halloween. We don't have a ton of news here this Friday, so if you got a little bit lighter of a commute on the way to work as you're listening to this show, hopefully I'll be able to get it in before you make it to the office. If you can, share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of this show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. All right, we're starting out today's show with an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. U.S. issues hundreds of secondary sanctions on firms in over a dozen countries. So the U.S. Treasury Department has issued hundreds of sanctions targeting companies in a handful of countries that Washington claims are helping Russia evade U.S. sanctions. The Treasury sanctioned 275 individuals and entities involved in supplying Russia with advanced technology and equipment that it desperately needs to support its war machine. Today's action targets both individual actors and sprawling sanctions evasions networks across 17 jurisdictions, which I think means countries, because then they list India, China, Switzerland, Thailand, and Turkey. So that was from the Treasury Department press release. Multiple U.S. presidents have increasingly sanctioned Russia, pushing Moscow to develop economic ties with India, China, and other nations in the global south. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, President Joe Biden said the U.S. would lead its allies in an economic war against Russia that would cripple Moscow's economy and bring the Kremlin's war machine to a halt. The Treasury claims the latest sanctions are a result of the economic war impacting Moscow's economy. The press release said, thanks to an unprecedented international sanctions regime implemented by the United Nations and its global partners, Russia is ever more reliant on a complex and expansive transnational schemes to procure critical technologies and manufacturing components and machinery it needs to create its weapons production capability. However, the sanctions war has largely backfired. As Ariel Petrovich explains at the Quincy Institute, sanctions are not just failing to end the war in Ukraine or weaken the Kremlin's war-fighting currency, they have also backfired, inadvertently strengthening Moscow's hardline position, undermining the utility of alternative strategies, and shoring up the Kremlin's future against international coercion. So, this is something that we've been talking about on the show. Of course, it hasn't hurt the Russian economy that much. I'm sure this war is having an impact on the Russian economy. All the additional spending towards war fighting rather than other productive means. At the same time, the actual sanctions campaign against Russia doesn't seem to have that much of an impact. And in fact, has kind of coalesced this, whatever you want to label it as, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO group, the BRICS Plus group, or what people call the Global South, which is generally, Africa, Asian countries, even Russia, even though, that's not in the Global South, and then would include some South American nations as well. And so, however you want to figure that, this group of countries has really coalesced more. Russia has much stronger ties with North Korea, which is a neighboring state, Iran, a Central Asian country very close to Russia. And so all these countries have strengthened their ties, not just economic ties, but also military ties. And so the sanctions have largely backfired for these reasons. It hasn't worked out the way the West wanted it to. And that's the reason they're putting on the secondary sanctions, not as the Treasury Department likes to claim as, oh, it's so successful, we just even have to have more success now. In reality, it's been an absolute failure. All right, next up here, let's talk about those North Korean troops that are allegedly fighting in Russia or Ukraine. So Zelensky lashes out at his Western backers over North Korean troops. This one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Ukrainian President Zelensky on Thursday lashed out at his Western backers over what he said was in action over the reports of North Korean troops being sent to Russia. So Zelensky said in an interview with South Korean media, Putin is checking the reaction in the West, and I believe after all these reactions, Putin will decide and increase the contingent. The reaction that is there today is nothing, it is zero. So also on Thursday, the Biden administration claimed there were 8,000 North Korean troops in Russia near the Ukrainian border. The U.S. expects the troops to join the fighting in Russia's Kursk Oblast, where Ukrainian forces control a small piece of territory and are being slowly pushed out by Russian troops. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S. has not seen these troops deployed into combat against Ukrainian forces, but would expect that to happen in the coming days. Russian officials have not confirmed that North Korean troops are in its territory, but have not been denying it and point to the military agreement between Moscow and Pyongyang signed earlier this year when asked about the issue. The deal includes a mutual defense clause. So on Wednesday, Russia's envoy to the UN said North Korea had the right to help Russia in its war since the West is supporting Ukraine. He said, even if everything that's been said about the cooperation between Russia and North Korea by our Western colleagues is true, why is that the United States and its allies are trying to impose on everyone the flawed logic that they have a right to help the Zelensky regime and Russian allies have no right to do a similar thing? North Korea previously denied sending troops to Russia, but recently said that if the rumors were true, it would be a lawful deployment. The North Korean Vice Foreign Minister Kim Jong-gui said on October 25th, if there is such a thing that the world media is talking about, I would think it will be an act of confirming the regulations of international war. Zelensky and hawks in the U.S. have been calling for major escalations in response to the North Korean deployment. The Ukrainian leader has been hyping the threat to push his so-called victory plan, which calls for the U.S. and NATO to support long-range strikes inside Ukraine, which risks nuclear war. And as I said, I thought that Ukraine was trying to leverage this, whether it's true or false news, but likely at least exaggerated claims, to either get NATO to sign off on long-range strikes with NATO weapons inside of Russia, or to get NATO to enter the conflict and start shooting down Russian missiles over Ukraine. I will just restate that I think what the Ukraine and now the U.S. are arguing here is an overstatement. I do not think that they are actually North Korean troops that are about to enter the fight in a serious way and in serious numbers. I think it would have bad PR optics, at least for the Russians. I'm not sure for the North Koreans. Now, maybe there will be some North Koreans enter combat. Pyongyang may see some advantage to that from their perspective of getting some of their troops, some battlefield experience going against NATO tactics and things like that, as Ukraine is a NATO proxy force with NATO trained soldiers. And so there may be some advantage there, but I don't see a big advantage to either Moscow or Pyongyang by deploying a bunch of their soldiers. Now, in a smaller number and not on the front lines, that's where I see a bigger advantage between these two new partners here. Their defense cooperation, their defense agreement is rather new. And so they may see an advantage of doing a little bit of war fighting together to start to figure out what kind of weapon systems of Russia that the North Koreans might be interested in. If they're deploying North Korean weapons to Russia, the North Korean troops could help them better use them on the battlefield. They will understand troubleshooting and things like that a little bit more before more proficiently trained on the weapons. And so I don't think it's impossible that there are some North Koreans that will fight, particularly in Kursk. That does seem a little bit more likely to me than actually going into Ukraine. But overall, I don't think this is going to be a major development in the war, at least from the Russia strategic advantage, in the sense of, they have access to all this manpower they didn't have before. I think Russia has plenty of manpower, so I don't think they really need North Korean soldiers. I mean, maybe Putin's going to use them as cannon fodder, but that seems a little bit unlikely to me as well. Dave wraps up his article here mentioning Representative Mike Turner, a Republican from Ohio and the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, has said that if Ukrainian soldiers attack Ukraine from Russian territory, the U.S. should support long-range strikes inside Russian territory using NATO missiles. An escalation Russian President Vladimir Putin has made clear would risk nuclear war. Turner also said that if North Korean troops enter Ukraine to fight, the U.S. should consider direct military action. Absolute insanity, and hopefully that's all this is and not actual policy being considered. All right, now let's move on and talk about Gaza, where we are witnessing the world's most obvious genocide unfold before our eyes every single day, and it's getting more and more blatant. The only thing that's making it a little bit obscure is that there's so few journalists left in northern Gaza because of the Israeli war, the Israeli murder of 170 plus journalists in Gaza, that now there's a little bit of a shroud over the situation because there's just not a lot of reports getting out. But Dave DeCamp writes here, Israeli troops prevent North Gaza residents from returning to their homes as a part of the ethnic cleansing plan. So the Israeli military is preventing residents of the Jabalia camp in North Gaza from returning to their homes as a part of their ethnic cleansing plan, Haaretz reported on Wednesday. The report said the military is blocking the return of approximately 50,000 residents to the area due to pressure from Israeli political leadership. It said the Israeli army acknowledged it's carrying out a partial implementation of the, quote, general's plan, which calls for the complete ethnic cleansing of all areas of Gaza north of the Nazarene Corridor, a strip of land controlled by the Israeli military. As a part of the ethnic cleansing campaign, Israel has cut off virtually all aid deliveries into northern Gaza since the beginning of October, and no aid has reached Jabalia or the areas around it. The Haaretz report said that senior Israeli military and Shin Bet officials acknowledged that the general's plan violates international law, but are claiming that the partial implementation does not, even though it has involved a starvation blockade and large-scale attacks on civilians. The report said the residents of the region will only be allowed to return after Israeli security control over the area is complete, including designating parts of it as demilitarized buffer zones. However, the general's plan does not say Palestinians can return to the north once it's cleansed, and Israeli soldiers have been destroying buildings, so they have nowhere to go back to. A Palestinian journalist who follows the social media activity of Israeli soldiers shared a video on X of a bulldozer destroying a building in Jabalia that was posted by an Israeli soldier. The report says, making sure they have nowhere to return to. The completion of the general's plan could pave the way for Jewish settlements in Gaza, an idea favored by many Israeli ministers and members of the Knesset. At a Resettle Gaza conference held on Monday, May Golan, a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, said the minister for social equality called for a new Nakba in Gaza. And isn't that insane that the minister of social equality, a position that you would kind of be horrified would exist in the United States, but seeing that it does exist, the idea that it's this Orwellian thing where the woman who runs it is calling for the extermination of one part of the Israel's population is just disgusting. Horrific. All right. Next up here, Israeli forces killed 41 more Palestinians over 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Thursday that Israeli forces killed at least 41 Palestinians and wounded 131 over the previous 24-hour period. The ministry's numbers only include the dead and wounded Palestinians who have been brought to hospitals or morgues. Medical sources told Al Jazeera that at least 45 Palestinians were killed by Israeli strikes on Thursday. Strikes were reported in central Gaza and in Gaza City in the north, and Al Jazeera reporters said Israeli troops began a ground incursion into Beit Lahana, a northern city that's been under total siege since the beginning of October and has been declared a disaster zone due to the lack of food, water, hospitals, doctors' services, and communications. Northern Gaza has been under Israeli siege as Israeli forces are attempting to carry out an ethnic cleansing plan known as the General's Plan. The campaign involves imposing starvation blockade, and the amount of aid entered into Gaza in October was the lowest of any month since last October. Gaza's health ministry said the hospital in Bet Lahana had come under Israeli attack. The ministry wrote on Telegram, Israeli occupation forces bombed the desalination plant for the kidney dialysis department, the engineering and maintenance department, and water tanks inside the hospital. Adding, Israeli occupation aircraft bombed the third floor of the hospital, and due to the bombing, the medicine warehouse was burned down. Medical supplies were received 5 days ago from the WHO. So hospital workers said the injured were injured as a result of the renewed Israeli attacks. The hospital had barely any staff as before the latest attack after Israeli troops arrested dozens of medical workers. This is from the director of nursing at the hospital, and this is what they told Al Jazeera. The hospital has no medical teams, doctors, surgeon, orthopedics. More than 33 people between doctors and nurses have also been arrested. Gaza's health ministry said the latest violence brought the death toll to 43,204 and the number of wounded to 101,641, figures that are considered undercounts. And a group of American healthcare workers who volunteered in Gaza estimate the true death toll is 118,000, including 60,000 people who have starved to death. All right, let's move on and talk about Lebanon. Netanyahu says Israel must be able to enforce any Lebanon ceasefire deal. So Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said Thursday that the U.S. must be able to enforce any ceasefire deal in Lebanon amid reports of ongoing truce negotiations. So Netanyahu told U.S. officials, according to Reuters, the main issue is not the paperwork of this or that agreement, but Israel's ability and determination to enforce the agreement and thwart any threats to its security from Lebanon. His comments came a day after Israel's Khan broadcaster reported on a leaked draft of a ceasefire deal that was drawn up by the U.S., which includes provisions that are non-starters for both Hezbollah and the Lebanese government. Under the draft deal, there would be an initial 60-day ceasefire, and during that time, Israeli troops would withdraw from southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah would move north of the Litani River. The Lebanese armed forces and UN peacekeepers would then be deployed to the area between the Litani River and the Israeli border in southern Lebanon. The ceasefire plan is similar to a UN Security Council Resolution 1701, except for two major differences. The U.S. plan will allow for Israeli planes to still fly over Lebanon, and the Israeli military would have the right to fire in self-defense and operate in southern Lebanon if they thought Hezbollah was violating the deal. And so this deal and what Netanyahu wants sound far more like a surrender from Hezbollah, which they haven't done, than an actual ceasefire deal. And to call this a ceasefire deal seems like a little bit of a propaganda ploy right before the election to pretend like, oh, there's something going on here that, we're trying to de-escalate the situation, when in reality, they're just offering Hezbollah a surrender, and Hezbollah and the Lebanese army is going to say no to that. Especially as Israel just continues to absolutely slaughter people in Lebanon. Israeli strikes in eastern Lebanon kill 6 paramedics. This from Jason Ditz. Despite some media reports claiming a ceasefire could happen in a matter of hours, Israeli airstrikes continued across Lebanon. As has been the case throughout the war, their targeting is no way confined to Hezbollah militants. And so this is really important. There's some sources saying that we're right on the verge of these ceasefire talks breaking through. Of course, from Dave's write-up, it seems pretty clear that that's not going to be the case. But if it was the case, you would expect Israel would at least stop bombing civilian targets to try to have fertile ground for this ceasefire to end up breaking through. And in fact, they're doing the opposite. So Jason says, today, during the course of their multiple airstrikes across the city of Baalbek and the surrounding areas, Israel hit a gathering port for civil defense workers, killing 4 paramedics. 2 more were killed in another attack around the city. Deliberate attacks on Paramedics and medical centers have been consistent in the air war that Israel has fought in Lebanon, and a lot of those have been slain in secondary attacks trying to rescue survivors from the initial Israeli strikes. In the past year, 178 paramedics have been killed, 297 wounded. 246 rescue vehicles, mainly ambulance, have been struck in those attacks. And those are absolutely off the chart numbers. There's some 2,000 people killed in Lebanon overall, so that, between like 8% of the killed are paramedics and medical professionals. It shows that Israel is intentionally targeting them. Of course, if this was happening, or if this was being done by any other country, so say Russia was doing this in Ukraine, somebody had targeted any kind of, firehouse in America, this would be a huge scandal. People would be upset. Our first responders are being killed. These are the best among us that, choose to live their life and put their lives on the line in the service of others, and they're being intentionally blown up when they're just medics is absolutely, I'm sure, something that the people of southern Lebanon really struggle to stomach. Also, in the long run, when you start killing this many paramedics, it is going to start in destroying this many ambulance. It is going to start to have an impact on emergency and healthcare services, and people are going to die who would otherwise survive. And not necessarily just people who are hit, by some Israeli shrapnel and are bleeding out, but people who have heart attacks and strokes and all other kinds of medical emergencies. If there's no paramedics to come to them, to get them to the hospital, then they're going to die. So the attacks on ambulances continued today as well, with one strike in the coastal city of Tyre, hitting and destroying an ambulance. The crew inside surprisingly survived the attack. The Lebanese health ministry has documented hundreds of Israeli attacks on healthcare workers, and their attacks have forced at least 8 hospitals to close, with 7 others operating at partial functionality due to the Israeli offensive. All right, wrapping up here today's show, and it looks like Iran may respond to Israel's attack after all. When we initially talked about the Israeli attack on Iran, it didn't seem that major of an attack. It seemed that the Iranians were able to defeat a part of the attack. 4 or 5 Iranians died, 4 people who are a part of the military, 1 civilian. So there is that. But overall, the Iranians seemed very interested in kind of touting victory and saying that, the Israelis came after us and didn't do any damage. We survived the attack. We're back operating just as we were before. Now, there's some reports, and I saw some satellite imagery that claims that that isn't true, that there's more significant damage at these military bases. I often find it's hard to actually analyze without having a significant amount of knowledge, just from satellite photos. Things that could seem like extensive damage may not actually be something that really hampers Iran's ability to operate its air defenses or produce missiles for that long of a time, or something that doesn't seem like a whole hell of a lot of damage could have destroyed something very important without leaving a huge trace behind. And so while satellite imagery can be helpful, it doesn't ultimately reveal. So there are still questions about how much damage the Israeli attack did. But again, given the Iranian reaction, my reaction was, I think Iran's going to try to de-escalate from here. But I did see that there was something from Iran saying that they could respond within a few days. And we now have this report, this one, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Israeli intel suggests Iran preparing to launch attack from Iraq. So Israeli sources told Axios on Thursday that Israeli intelligence suggests Iran is preparing to launch a reprisal attack on Israel from Iraqi territory in the coming days, and that it could happen before the November 5th U.S. presidential election. The Israeli source said the Iranian attack could involve a large number of drones being fired from Iraq. They said launching the attack from Iraq through Iranian allied Shia militias could be an attempt to avoid another round of Israeli airstrikes on Iranian territory. If another escalation starts from Iraq, U.S. troops in the country and neighboring Syria could come under attack. Since the U.S. has vowed it will defend Israel, there are about 100 U.S. troops in Israel as a part of a deployment of THAAD air defense missile systems. So a U.S. official told Axios that the U.S. doesn't know if a decision has been made in Iran to attack Israel. Israel has launched a series of airstrikes against military targets in Iran on October 26, killing 4 soldiers and 1 civilian. Iran has downplayed the extent of the damage to its air defense systems, saying it's already repaired them, but Iranian officials are still vowing a response. Brigadier General Ali Faladvi, the deputy commander of the IRGC, told Al Mayadeen on Thursday that the Iranian response was inevitable, saying Iran could target everything from the Zionist possesses in a single operation. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a threat against Iran on Thursday, saying the Israeli military has a greater freedom of action in the country than ever before. He said, "The supreme goal I gave to the Israeli Defense Forces and the security branches is to prevent Iran from achieving a nuclear weapon." Israel's attacks on Iran came in response to the October 1st Iranian missile barrage that targeted military sites in Israel, which came as a retaliation for a series of Israeli military escalations in the region, including the killing of Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh while he was visiting Tehran. So, I guess a couple things here. If it was just the Israeli report, I would be skeptical. I'm skeptical that it would come from Iraq for a number of reasons. The main one being, I know the Iraqi government has really stressed that it doesn't want to end up in the middle of an Israel-US-Iran war. And so if Iran was planning to launch a major attack from Iraqi soil, who knows what card the Iraqi government will play. And while the Iraqi government is certainly friendly with the Iranians, that doesn't mean that they are subservient or would allow their country to be used for a major drone attack against Israel, especially because I'm sure Israel would conduct a huge retaliation response. Now, Iran does have some militias that is very close with in Iraq. Now, the only my skepticism here is that these militias typically attack American soldiers and not Israel. And so could they attack Israel for Iran? Certainly possible, but I would think their interest would be far more in attacking the U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Syria, because their goal is to end the occupation of Iraq by the Americans, not necessarily starting an entire war with Israel. Now, the Iranian brigadier general making the statement that the IRGC was preparing a response is interesting, because the IRGC does, operate inside and outside of Iran. And so it's possible that he is somehow involved with the Iraqi Shia militias or something like that. But more importantly, it's just a military official saying that the Iranians are going to respond. And so that doesn't completely validate what the Israeli official is saying, but it also doesn't really counter it either. So I think it's at least worth considering that Iran is preparing a response, and who knows how soon it could come. Now, again, in my initial analysis of this, I said in the past, I think Iran would tout what Israeli did and basically repelling the Israeli attack as a victory, and that they would allow the situation to de-escalate from there. However, after the Iranian missile barrage on Israel on October 1st, they made very clear that the rules of the game have changed, and any Israeli response will invoke Iranian retaliation. And so maybe Iran is going to be eager to prove that's the case, that these are no longer the old rules of the game. I still think the Iranians could maybe just kind of say that they came out on top in this tit for tat, and how often does that happen with Israel, that any country comes out on top? But at the same time, the Iranians may really want to live up to their word. And if that's the case, then I guess we will see some kind of Iranian strike on Israel, whether it comes directly from Iran or through one of its allies in the region, the Shia militias of Iraq, the Syrian government, or its allied Shia forces, Hezbollah, or even the Houthis All right, everybody, thank you all so much for tuning into the show this week. I hope you have a good weekend, not inundated with too many political messages and calls, and we will be back with shows all next week. My guess is, Monday and Tuesday, I'll keep it fairly newsy, and then Wednesday, we'll have to do something kind of breaking down the election and, of course, whoever ends up becoming president. I still am really just betting on that it's going to be Donald Trump at this point. We'll break down what their incoming cabinet may be like and how that could change U.S. policy. Thank you all so much for tuning in.